Motley Crue ruled the world back in the 80s. The band was formed in 1981 by Tommy Lee and Nikki Sixx. The rest, as they say, was history. Their 1983 breakthrough album, Shout at the Devil, catapulted them to the top of the industry. Their reputation for rock and roll excess only deepened their fame. A constant stream of hard drugs, booze, and beautiful women followed the band everywhere they went. But by the decade's end, a new sound would start to take hold in rock music. From glam to grunge, Motley Crue would take a back seat to an emerging movement in rock that saw bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam see explosive overnight success. The bands looked and sounded very different from groups like Crue, Warrant, and Def Leppard, to name a few. The hairspray, eyeliner, and showmanship that came with the glam metal era were traded in by the new wave of grunge bands rising to fame. Many of these bands made it no secret that they weren't fans of the previous glam rock era that had preceded them. Among these bands, few were as outspoken about that time as Pearl Jam. Today we're looking back on the feud between two of rock music's greatest bands from two different time frames, who still apparently have no love lost between them. We're talking about the feud between Pearl Jam and Motley Crue. Before we continue, there are a lot of you who are returning viewers who have not yet subscribed. Welcome back and thank you for watching Rockfeed. If you can take a quick second to hit that subscribe button, we would really appreciate it and it would help support the channel. The early 90s Seattle grunge movement signaled a seismic shift in rock music from the previous decade. The two sounds didn't mesh well, and with the explosive success of grunge, the glam bands of the 80s started to seem dated. In an interview earlier this year with the New York Times, Pearl Jam frontman Eddie Vedder revealed he despised Motley Crue during the late 80s. He told them in the interview, "You know, I used to work in San Diego loading gear at a club. I'd end up being at shows that I wouldn't have chosen to go to. Bands that monopolized late 80s MTV. The metal bands that, I'm trying to be nice, I despised. Girls, girls, girls and Motley Crue. Fuck you. I hated it. I hated how it made the fellas look. I hated how it made the women look. It felt so vicious. Guns N' Roses came out and thank God at least had some teeth. But I'm circling back to say that one thing that I appreciated was that in Seattle and the alternative crowd, the girls could wear their combat boots and sweaters, and their hair looked like Cat Powers and not Heather Locklear's. Nothing against her. They weren't selling themselves short. They could have an opinion and be respected. I think that's a change that lasted. It sounded so trite. But before then, it was bustiers. The only person who wore a bustier in the 90s that I could appreciate was Perry Farrell. In a conversation with Ultimate Guitar, Twisted Sister's Dee Snider said that members of Pearl Jam would become physically violent if you called them a grunge band. He said, "I loved them. When they first came out, it wasn't even called grunge." And this is the thing about titles, even heavy metal, punk, hair metal. Those are not titles chosen by the artists. They're titles chosen by the writers. And usually as a negative connotation, usually as a turn of a put down. In the artists that they called grunge, called punk, called heavy metal, they hated it. This is a fact, dude. I'm old. I know this. A fact. If you mention grunge to Soundgarden or Pearl Jam, they got physically violent with you. They were just a rock band. And if anything, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, they were metal bands. They were touring with Ozzy. For his part, Motley Crue bassist Nikki Sixx doesn't believe that grunge actually killed hair metal. He told Kerrang in a 2019 interview, quote, "I have to say that I don't think Nirvana and Pearl Jam killed the bands you mentioned. I think that they killed themselves. They were making copycat music. We, on the other hand, simply imploded. Forget about the lifestyle for a minute. The thing that ultimately allowed us to pull ourselves through was the music that we made and how good we can be when we really put it together. Every great band has hills and valleys. They start at the bottom, and if they're lucky, they make it to the top of the mountain. But eventually you have to go down. Very few bands are lucky enough to become popular and stay popular forever. That's just the way music is. It changes. Technology changes. Fashion changes. And social outlooks change. But again, today a lot of the bands are just so fucking safe. In 1994, Motley Crue performed with a new frontman, John Corabi. He spoke in a 2014 interview about the band's 1994 American tour, calling it a nightmare. He said, We weren't selling tickets. It was just horrible. He also noted in the interview, everybody was listening to Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. At that point, we were considered passé. It's simply a mixed bag when you ask hair metal musicians whether grunge contributed to the downfall of that era. But regardless, there's certainly no love lost. So, in response to that earlier New York Times interview where Eddie Vedder said he despised Motley Crue bassist Nikki Sixx fired back at Pearl Jam, and he didn't mince words. He said, quote, "Made me laugh today reading how much the singer in Pearl Jam hated Motley Crue. Now, considering that they're one of the most boring bands in history, it's kind of a compliment, isn't it?" But Nikki Sixx didn't stop there, noting that he will always defend his band. In a later interview on a Brazilian podcast, Sixx pointed out Vedder's massive multi-million-dollar fortune, while he says he dresses like he shops at a thrift store to pretend he's just some guy from the 90s. He said, "I'm not trying to be the guy that wrote the Motley Crue song Bastard, cause I'm not the guy that wrote Bastard. I wrote that song about somebody that ripped us off. I am the guy that if you fuck with me, I will fuck with you back. And that's what that song is about. You take a swipe at my band, I'll take a swipe at your band. You try to hurt my family, which is my band, I will try to hurt you." That's not something to be proud about. Nikki pointed out that he was a fan of Nirvana, and Motley Crue was never afraid to embrace change. He said, quote, "We've never been afraid to embrace music changing because that's the whole idea behind music. If you listen to Too Fast for Love and then you listen to The Dirt, you're like, well, it's the same band, but it has grown. So we've never had a problem with that. My only thing is, you want to take a crack at my band, I'm probably going to say something back. But what I don't understand is why the guy is even talking about my band. He's a successful guy. Listen, let's face it. The guy flies around in private jets. He lives in a mansion in a gated community. He sells out stadiums. And then he dresses at the thrift store and tries to pretend to be some guy in the 90s. Don't take a swipe at my band, dude. I mean, I'm at least being honest." Eddie Vedder appeared to further diss Motley Crue during a solo performance in Newark, New Jersey back in February, with Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith serving as his touring drummer. He said, quote, "That drum kit, that silver, beautiful machine that he is the engine of, does not need to elevate or rotate to do its job. Let me just point that out," appearing to reference Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee's drum set that raises and spins during their performances. In response to Nikki Sixx labeling Pearl Jam boring, the band shared a video of their fans excited during their show, writing, "We love our bored fans." While Eddie Vedder noted that he despised Motley Crue, his bandmate, Pearl Jam guitarist Stone Gossard, is defending Motley Crue. He said during an appearance on Revolver's Fan First podcast, "Jeff and Mike and I loved hard rock, went through it all. I bought the first Motley Crue leather records. I thought it was, at the time, it was punk-like. It had the same, it's like Motorhead. There were things about it that I was discovering about British hard rock at the time that also felt rebellious or against the norm that made me interested in it. And I always liked heavy, Sabbath and Zeppelin, and then NWA and moving sort of into industrial heavy. But it always had to have a song." The grunge and hair metal debate ultimately doesn't matter much because Motley Crue and Pearl Jam are still hugely successful touring artists. Many bands didn't endure the rise and fall of hair metal as Motley Crue did, but it's clear with a full touring schedule in 2023 and their newly announced addition of John 5, this band is ready to go full steam ahead. As for Pearl Jam, they're still just as active, playing shows all around the world this year. So it really comes down to personal preference with the fans, and it's an intense debate. Which era did you prefer, hair metal or grunge? Let us know in the comments down below. And again, thank you for watching Rockfeed. We really do appreciate it. If you could take a quick moment and hit subscribe, it's the best way to support this channel. Thanks again for tuning in, and consider checking out the recommended video up on your screen.